You're all very welcome. The Duncade Crenúdan Saura to this first summer meeting, and I'm no doubt that you'll enjoy it. A very interesting topic tonight. I find it a challenge to introduce our speaker, Gerard Corcoran, because of his many accomplishments and the little bio that I have here of him. But essentially, he is a leader in innovation and research partnerships. And that covers a multitude, of course. But Gerard has traveled extensively and lived in many EU countries and over 60 cities in China. And he's heavily involved in all these smart cities task forces. As you know, the smart cities, it's all about deploying wireless and broadband, and these are essential to smart city applications. And the drive behind it is to educate and advocate and to drive development in modern cities, and thus to provide economic, environmental, and social sustainability. But the main interest that we have in him tonight is that he is the founder of the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, which has 20,000 members worldwide. So we hope that he's going to open the Pandora's box for us, or at least give us some information about genetic genealogy and where our research may fit in and link with that. So I would respectfully request you all to mute, and we'll give the floor to Gerard. You're very welcome, Gerard. Fear fault your oath.
Thank you, John. And is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just clarify one thing, John. It's I founded the chapter of genetic genealogy in Ireland, right? Which has 7,000 members, and our global ISOGG, we have 20,000 members, right? So Ireland is punching above its weight, you know, in terms of activity. Of course, most of those people are in the diaspora. You know, these are mainly people outside of Ireland who are interested. Yeah, and I manage about 4 DNA projects. One is for Genetic Genealogy Ireland, DNA Outreach Ireland, which is part of our outreach events, Irish Midlands projects, where some of my ancestors came from, and the Galway DNA project, where my maternal ancestors came from. I have a lot of slides, so I'll go through them quite quickly so that we have a little time for Q&A at the end. And if I'm not going fast enough, just give me a prompt and I'll do it. Right, so what is ISOGG? ISOGG, let me say, I have the screens are, I'm seeing the screens. Maybe I have to adjust something here.
It looks very clear here, Gerard.
Yeah, okay. Because the part of it is covering, let me see. No, it's fine. Okay, it's fine now. Good. So ISOGG, the projects I'm interested in at the moment, the evolution of genetic genealogy in Ireland. We have project administration in Ireland. We do surname and middle administration. We look at the vendors and so on and so forth. Celtic migrations, which is looking at where were people before they came to Ireland? Which countries did they go through? Where are our deep ancestry? And also the Irish reference genome. This could be, you know, the Irish DNA Atlas is part of the Irish reference genome. So it's looking at all of the different reference genomes which have been produced, which are relevant to Ireland, and using genetic genealogy platform. And that's the topic of today's project or presentation. So I'll give you my experience, you know, by looking at a few of the DNA vendors. How did I use it to solve some of the genealogy challenges I had? Okay, and some of the things we do let me skip this one. Right, so we look at the market for direct-to-consumer genetics. These are DNA testing for genetics. I've been doing it for about 15 years now, but it's really in 2017 that the market took off. It went through an inflection point, and this is where it started to grow exponentially. And now they're up to about 40 million people worldwide who have taken tests. And globally, you have the 4 big companies are Ancestry Dna, and they have 20 million customers. 23andMe have 10 million. MyHeritage 5 million. Family3DNA 2 million. And Genographic was the very first one, but that research project is finished now. It was a 10-year project. And then there are some full genome sequencing companies like Full Genomes, Dante Lab, Nebula Genetics, and then there are the medical genetic companies like Genealogy Science. They do genetics for healthcare. I'm on the patient advisory board of Genealogy Science, so that's a slight look into the medical applications of DNA. Ancestry Dna you'll see a few of these slides have a French translation. This is because I gave this presentation in French, but everything else is in English. Ancestry did a very interesting peer-reviewed study, which had 770,000 samples. This is a huge cohort by any standards, by any scientific research project. To have a cohort that size is quite incredible. And they were able to analyze in quite good detail what is the granularity of the Irish population, what happened to the people when they emigrated from Ireland, they went to the US, which states did they go to, at what periods did they emigrate, and so on and so forth. So we will use some of those insights in our presentation today. So the first test I took, one of the tests I took was Ancestry Dna. And during sale time, you can get it for about $59, something like that. Normally, it's about $99, right? So the first thing you do is look at your ancestors, where it come from. If I look from a European point of view, they tell me I'm 94% Irish, and they say I have a little bit of Scottish and I have a little bit of Scandinavian, right? So we will try and understand where these different bits of ancestry came from. So this is deep ancestry, not recent ancestry. And then if I look at Ireland, they tell me that I'm 94%, and a little bit of Scotland on the, I suppose, the Gaelic side of Scotland, and a little bit of Brittany. So that would make me sort of a little bit archetypical Celtic, if you like. But the main interest in this test is it zooms in on my recent ancestry. That means the last 400 years, and it pinpoints me to Connacht, right? And if you look at the Venn diagrams, where all of the Venn diagrams intersect, that piece in the middle, that's exactly where my maternal ancestry came from, right? And it will analyze this going through different eras, right? And then I zoom in on that small piece in the middle, and this is where these are all the town lines I'm familiar with. This is where my mother was born, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, and so on and so forth, going back, about 400 years. And the magic, everyone has their own magic townlands. My magic townlands are Gurchin and Kilnalapa. Gurchin's where my mother was born, and Kilnalapa where my grandmother and great-grandmother and so on and so forth were born. And all around are places where my ancestors came from, right? And if I map that next to a Google map showing the actual townlands, which I'm researching, it's a pretty good match. So they have been quite effective in zooming in of using my DNA and not any of the data, where my ancestors came from. One of the branches I'm researching is my Magnon branch, right, which was my great-great-grandmother. And we see that they're from places like Gurchin, Carrocaltra, Derrymore, Lisconnor, Boyna, and so on and so forth. So this again, the DNA is telling me that these are the localities I should be researching. So one of the features of Ancestry DNA is it will go through the different, using the very large cohort which they have. They will develop a storyboard for me of where my ancestors were doing at different timelines. So they say in the 18th century, things were very bad in Galway and Connacht. This was during the penal laws. On the land it was very difficult. Many people were tenant farmers, and so on and so forth. And then it moves to the 1800s. These were Napoleonic Wars. Trade was a little bit better. You had the Ballinasloe horse markets. So many of the horses going in the Continental Wars were bought in Ballinasloe. Prices were a little bit better on the land, so there was a bit of a reprieve. And then in 1825, things got a lot better again. There was a bit of land clearances, there were problems on the land and evictions, and emigration started in earnest at that time. And then, of course, the 1850s was the famine. It was catastrophic. And, the Great Famine had devastated Connacht. 30% of its residents either died or emigrated. Those who couldn't support themselves entered into the workhouses, and Mayo had over 9 workhouses. And this led to massive emigration, okay? And of course, many of my ancestors were part of this. And then 1875, there was more crop failure, and this is what we're seeing at this stage is serial emigration. So the first people who emigrated before the famine or during the famine, they worked in America, they sent back to fare for the next brother or sister who came along after them, and entire families emigrated this way. So this was really the experience in my family, and I'll show what that led to and what effect it had on some of my relatives. And then by 1925, the Irish had established themselves. There were no longer signs of Irish not wanted. They had gone through the Tammany system. They had achieved political power. They became mayors of their communities. They became leaders of their communities. And so they were building, they were part of the American dream, right? So again, we will try to have a look at some practical examples. So the previous 5 slides has been a storyline which Ancestry generated for me, right? Based on their knowledge of the hundreds of thousands of people who have tested and had experienced it. And remarkably, it is quite close to my particular case. So one of the things, the first thing I find with my Ancestry match is that I have 17,000 matches, which is enormous. There are 17,000 people who share part of my DNA out there who are related to me in some ways. Close matches of fourth cousin are closer, about 500, and the rest are very distant who I wouldn't know about, right? However, there's a very powerful feature in Ancestry. It's called through lines, right? So this will look at my family tree. It will look at my shared DNA. It will compare those, and it will evaluate what are the likelihoods of X, Y, and Z people being closely related to me. And going through that process, it is identifying, about 52 people who I should be able to identify, who normally, with my paper records, I'd never be able to identify. So I worked through that process. So the first thing I do is draw a family tree. Well, this is really a fan. It's another way of looking at a family tree. And if I can go to 5 generations, that's sort of good enough for me, right? I have a few gaps there. In fact, if I had enough time to devote this, I should be able to fill in all of the gaps, right? But this is pretty typical of your Irish researcher, right? They'll be able to get back to the early 1800s, maybe into the 1700s, and that's it. We can't go beyond it because we've hit a brick wall, okay? So what can we do? What I do is I reverse this fan. I pick out an ancestor here where we had large immigration, and I find out what I have on the other side of the ocean, what I have in America. So I look at, I try to get my pointer, here it is, yeah. So my mom, my grandmother, Nora, my great-grandmother, Mary Mannion, my great-great-grandmother, Nellie Gerety, okay? Now, I will look at Nellie, right? Here she is, Ellen Gerety, and she had a daughter called Bridget Donlan, right? And she lived in Kilnalappa. And Bridget is quite a remarkable story. She married a chap called Thomas Nolan, and Thomas had been married 3 times before he married Bridget. His first wife died in childbirth, quite young. They had 2 children. His second wife died also, quite young, 2 children. And he eloped with Bridget rather, when Bridget was 17 or 18. Okay, so these things happened in those days, and they had 11 children together. And virtually the whole family, with the exception of 2, emigrated in serial migration to the US. This was the typical, famine example of massive migration to the States. And on the left, I've drawn up Bridget's tree, okay, here. And I was able to complete it more than my tree. And why is this? Because they had records in the US. They didn't have records in Ireland, or all the records were burnt in the forecourts. So this is a way of building up trees and getting to know your own ancestors by almost doing inverse genealogy, if you like. So we'll have a look at Bridget's tree. And here is Bridget. And I'm going to focus in on 3 of her daughters. Nora, she immigrated and she married a chap called Herman Michel. Anne, she migrated and she married a chap called Daniel Phelan, who was an Irishman from Tipperary. And Celia migrated and she married a chap called Flynn, Harry Flynn from County Roscommon. Okay, and I will have a look at those 3 cases. Now remember, these people left in the most dire conditions, almost on coffin ships, right? Very poor conditions, very difficult. Once they got to New York, they went on to Cincinnati. They had to cross the deserts and so on and so forth. So this is Bridget here. She's the mother of the clan. When she emigrated after she had sent all of her children, after she had sent 9 of her children to America. And each one went individually, worked and sent back to Fair. And they eventually, and when the last one went over, she went over with them at the age of 60. And she had to get special permission to enter America because she was 60 years old and so on and so forth. And for the rest of her life, she traveled around America staying with one or other of her daughters. She couldn't read or write, but she had facilitated or organized the migration of most of her children to America. And this is, now I'm very fortunate in that I mentioned Anne, who married Daniel Phelan, and his uncle was also Phelan. They settled in Whittier. One of the daughters was Regina, and Regina has written what I can only think is the definitive account of a pioneer's life migrating to California. So she has written and basing it on her own family's experience. So she talks about the going across the deserts, migrating in wagon trains, going through the Gila crossing, which was the southern route over the Sierra Nevadas, eventually working on the railways, eventually when the trains were built, crossing on the railways. Some of them didn't cross across America to go from east to west. They went from down to Panama. The Panama Canal wasn't built at that time, so they crossed the land bridge at Panama and came up to San Diego. Some of them went all the way around the Horn, right, to get to California and to arrive in California for the gold rush, okay? And so Regina Phelan wrote these books. There must have been 8 of the books. I have a few of them, and they document extremely well the experience of the family. They have very, very good sketches, and it is part of the National Collection of California. There was another daughter from the other Phelan branch. Her name was Catherine, and I remember when I was a little boy in Dublin, she visited our home, and she was very elderly at that stage, but she wrote the book about the family of Bridget Donnellan, who became Bridget Nolan, okay? And this is Tom and Mary Phelan. These are the parents of Regina Phelan, and these are some of their sons, and this is Regina here. It was originally a black and white photograph, but I have a little tool which allows me to colorize photos. So this is a colorized photograph of Regina with some of her nieces and nephews. Okay, so there are three of the daughters I want to talk to. One of them was Nora. She married Herman Michel. Okay, Nora family were dairy farmers, right? So she and Herman came from Switzerland, and his family also were dairy farmers. So the first thing they did was set up a dairy. Okay, this was called the Santa Monica Dairy Company. It grew to be the largest dairy in Southern California. They had 100 dairy trucks outside here, and it eventually changed its name to Egmar Dairies. And we'll have a look here. You can see this is the Beverly Hills branch of the Santa Monica Dairy Company, and you see they had horses in their fleet, and 10 years later they had all Model T Ford trucks in their fleet. So Nora and Herman, although they both left their countries in dire poverty, in the space of the same generation, they had built up effectively the largest private dairy in California. Herman later became the mayor of Santa Monica. And yeah, the second daughter was Celia. Celia married Harry Flynn. Harry Flynn's was from Roscommon. They were beef cattlemen, if you like. Okay, so he brought his skill and knowledge of beef to America, He established the meat market in San Fernando and thrived very, very successfully. Harry unfortunately died not too late, and his son Leo took over, but his wife bought the Porter Hotel, which was the largest hotel in San Fernando, and Leo, their child, became the mayor of San Fernando, and the Flynns were known. This became the headquarters of the Republic. They established the Republican Party in San Fernando, and Leo became the head of the Republican Party there. And these are postcards of the Porter Hotel. And these are various photographs which I found. The very top one here, you can see a typical Republican Party meeting, but these are the Phelans. This is Bridget here. You have Regina. You have Joe and Annie Phelan. These are the children. And again, Catherine, who I've circled here on the right, she was the genealogist of the family. And fortunately for me, she had written a small booklet on the history of the family. And every year from 1935 onwards, they had an annual picnic, right? And the picnic got bigger and bigger and bigger as the families got bigger and bigger and bigger. But also they had photographs of these families. So we see on the photograph in the middle, I'm trying to get my cursor to work here. Yes, here we go. This is Nora. This is Anne, who married Phelan. This is Catherine, one of the other daughters who emigrated from Ireland. And this is Catherine Phelan, who I'm eternally indebted to because she wrote down the genealogies of the families. And here is a later family picnic in 1959. And again, we can follow the families growing up, we can follow the children, we have the names, we can follow how they changed over time, how the tribe, the clan grew bigger, and they prospered, and they worked hard. They worked extremely hard, but they lived in certain cases the American dream. So these are grainy old photographs, but I've using artificial intelligence and some technology to brighten up the photographs so that we can get a better idea of what our ancestors and our people on our family tree look like. And this is what I was able to extract from those grainy old photographs, enhance them, brighten them up a little bit. Here is Nora, and here's Herman here, who established the Santa Monica Dairy Company. And there's something else. This is Annie and Joe. So what I'd like to do is to bring them to life. And this is what they may have looked like when they were alive. We can, take old photographs of them and imagine, how they may have looked in real life. Okay, there are two other people I'm researching on my family tree. One of them is General Michael Corcoran. He founded the Fighting 69, and he was from County Mayo. I'm trying to establish whether he's the same branch as mine. And the second one is this gentleman. He was Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was the Eli O'Carroll, and the Corcorans were one of the branches of the Eli O'Carroll. And we have established that a branch of the Corcorans is the same DNA as the Eli O'Carroll from Offaly. And this branch of the Eli O'Carroll emigrated to the US after dispossession by Cromwell. Their land was restored and they were granted land in Maryland. They became the largest landowners in Maryland, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. Maryland was a bit exceptional that Catholics in power were tolerated more so than any of the other states in the US. So again, I will try to bring these two gentlemen to life using our little piece of software. And here we are again. So now, the previous one was my experience with Ancestry. Now I'm going to move on to FTDNA, and FTDNA is extremely good for the Y chromosome or for testing your Y chromosome, and your Y chromosome allows you to go back through the paternal line. The Y chromosome is inherited from father to son. So I've taken the test here myself, and this is my father Thomas. He was born in 1900, died 2000, and his father Stephen, and his father Thomas, and his father John, and his father Thomas, and his father Hugh, and it goes, his father again was Hugh, and it goes back further. Okay. I matched a gentleman called Bill Corcoran, right? And we were only sharing a very small piece of DNA, 0.01%, but we matched on the Y chromosome, and he had the same surname. So this indicated we were probably related. So I focused in on him, and we did our research, and I helped him establish his, he had already done his ancestry. Again, I'm trying to get my cursor to work here. Let me just see if I can make it pointer option, laser pointer. How about that? Ah, that's much better. So this is Bill, and this is the guy who matched, and his father was James, and his father was John, and his father was Michael, and Michael had emigrated from Ireland. And then I did research on my side. I found that this Thomas had a brother Michael, and he had a son Michael, and he had a son Michael, who was this Michael here. So we joined up the dots, we connected our trees, and then I ordered a more sophisticated Y test, which confirmed without any doubt whatsoever that we were the same branch, and that they had emigrated from Ireland in the 1800s, and established themselves in Minnesota, right? So again, I did this inverted genealogy, okay, and I tapped into their trees using the matching DNA, and this was the family. Let me see, who do we have here? Yes, so you had the Michael Corcoran who emigrated. He had a son, John, who married Catherine Scully, and they had all of these children here. And he had a son, James Benedict, and James had a son, William Corcoran. Now, what happened is that James's wife died in childbirth, so the children, it was considered that men weren't capable of looking after children in those days, and the children were farmed out to relatives, and William was farmed out to the grandparents, right, to Catherine and John, and so he grew up with Catherine and John here, okay? And this is their three, and this is the Michael who emigrated, and he married Mary Corcoran, who was also a Corcoran. That was her maiden name, and these were their children, and this is the James, and his son was John, who married Catherine, and then their child was Bill. And again, I was able to extract a whole new branch of families, and these were the Minnesota Corcorans. And the only way I could possibly have researched this branch of my tree was using DNA. Okay, so this is Clanford Cathedral, and it's in East Galway. And if you look at all of this part at the entrance gateway here, pretty much all of these graves here are Corcoran graves. These are my ancestors going back to the 17th century. And I'll explain a little bit about history before. This little square here, this is the grave of Brendan the Navigator, the founder of Clonfert Monastery. Obviously, it wasn't a stone monastery in those days. It was a wooden monastery, but the stone monastery was built later, and the tower, of course, was built later as a Church of Ireland. Today, it's a Church of Ireland graveyard, but of course, all of my ancestors were Catholic, but they'd been there since prior to the Reformation. So this is the oldest continuously used place of worship in Ireland. So we found, all of my ancestors' graves here. And again, these were the graves of the ancestors of William. So I organized a gathering back in 2013. We invited about 20 of them over from Minnesota. This is Bill here. Unfortunately, he passed away recently on his 98th birthday, or on his 98th year. I presented him with his certificate of Irish heritage. This is his family, his grandchildren and children here. And I took them around to some typical Irish farms. We took them to the original farmhouse where they occupied. We took them to the graves of his ancestors. We took them to all of his living cousins who were still living here. Okay, and I'll just go back. How did we get to Clonfert? Well, the Corcoran's documented in the annals in Clonfert back to the 11th century. Okay, but our branch went over there after Cromwell. They were living in Lura in County Tipperary at the time of the Cromwellian invasion. The Kennedys of Lura, of Lackeen Castle, they lost their property, and all of the attendant families, and the Corcorans were one of those families. They were the Aronachs of the Kennedys. They were driven west and they settled in Clonfert. The Kennedys returned shortly afterwards. Some of their lands were restored. The Corcorans returned in the 19th century to Lura, and that's where my father was born. At the same time as we migrated over, another branch of Corcorans came over from Tipperary at exactly the same time. They migrated in vast wagon trains, which went over. There was only one bridge crossing the Shannon at that time. That area was Portumna. They crossed over that. It's been recorded that there was a long wagon trains of millstones and things, and these were millers, right? And they also settled in Galway, and they established mills around Dunmore. There are 10 mills around Dunmore, some of them existing. And this branch I'm working on, we're working to see, are we the same branch? There's circumstantial evidence and there's DNA evidence that we are the same branch, but we have to order big Y tests and or Y700 tests, and we'll check to see if that branch is the same branch as my branch, which migrated over in 1650s, according to the Down Survey. It's recorded in the Down Survey. And this is one of the mills in Tuam. It's a working mill. It's also a museum. And so that branch had about 10 mills in County Galway. This is another branch, again, I found through DNA. This was from my paternal grandmother, who was Bridget Walsh. She lived in Lura. They emigrated to Australia. They didn't like it in Australia. They went on to San Francisco. This gentleman, the son of the man who emigrated, he became an architect in San Francisco, and he built most of the, certainly all of the large churches in San Francisco and many of the notable public buildings in San Francisco. Unfortunately, some were destroyed during the Great Earthquake of 1904, but many of them are still standing, and his direct descendant is living in one of his houses today. That's Catherine, and I matched Catherine through my DNA, so I was able to research this branch through my DNA matches. Okay, so another thing we can do with Y-DNA is look past our deep ancestry. Okay, going back. Hello? Yeah, going back thousands of years. So this gentleman here represents my ancestor who was migrating maybe thousands of years ago. So this is, if I tested my Y-DNA, I found that my near terminal SNP is called S5456. If I put that into a program called the SNP tracker, it will tell me my migration paths of my ancestor going back 100,000 years. Okay, so out of Africa a long time ago, 40,000 years ago, and then it went all into Asia, and then it came around here, and then around the Caspian Sea, and then about this time, this is the interesting period. This is in the Caucasus, and it's about 10,000 years ago, right? And this was so the Caucasus were like Italy and like Spain. It was a refuge during the Ice Age, and then in the post-Ice Age era, the ice sheets melted. We had the massive floods, which many say lead to the many flood myths in all the civilizations of the world. And then we had the demographic explosions of population in the Yamana people here. These were the herders. They migrated west. They became bell beakers. They migrated into isles, and they replaced 90% replacement of the populations of the isles. So the farmers who were previously there, they were replaced by the bell beakers. So we'll have a look at what happened during that period. And in the Caucasus, it was very interesting. We had the steppes on the North Caucasus. We had the Iranian and the what we call Iranian Caucasus hunter-gatherer on the south. This was the development of farming. This led to the agricultural revolution, the first domesticated animals, and so on and so forth. And the steppes was the domestication of the horse and the large migrations westward into Europe. But there's a certain amount of admixture going on around the threats, and this is called CHG, Caucasian hunter-gatherer. So these were at that. And there are two main broad migrations. One was the Yamnaya coming west, becoming the cordate ware, then becoming the bell beaker, and the bell beaker populating the western Atlantic seaboard in the Bronze Age. But the earlier migration, and this brought my Y-DNA marker, OR1b. OR1b is the typical marker in Ireland. And the previous migration was the farmers, and they pretty much came from Anatolia, migrated west, and then up the Atlantic facade. And this one apparently brought my maternal DNA marker, which is called H1C1. Right? So we'll go back, and if we look at all these numbers here, there's I will just highlight some of them. Oh yes, in the Caucasus, or L389, M269, this is the big one, L51, P312, L21, DF13, and S54, 56. So we'll see where were they during, or where is the highest population of those markers today. So the highest of the R1B the Yamna marker, the highest percentage is in Europe. This is the step component. And the highest in all of Europe is in the Isles, and the highest in the Isles is in Ireland, and the highest in Ireland is in the west of Ireland, right? And this one here is the L51. It's highest around the Rhine, around France, and also strangely enough in Eastern Ireland. And P312, this is considered the Celtic marker. It's highest on the Atlantic facade in the traditional Celtic countries, and the highest is in Ireland, and the highest in Ireland is in the west of Ireland. And then L21 is the Isles marker, and again, the highest concentration in the Isles, and the highest in Ireland, and the highest in the west of Ireland. So we have a familiar story. The sister clade of L21 is called R1B U152, and this we call the Alpine clade because it you could consider it the ancient Gauls, if you like, around France and Switzerland and Italy. And DF27 is very much Iberian, right? So these are the sister clades of L21, L21 being the Irish one. And M222, you've probably heard of. This is the Nile of the Nine Hostages marker. This is Northwest Ireland, but also Mayo. The highest concentration is Mayo. And or would be L21 outside of M222, or my marker DF21 is this one, which is highest in the west of Ireland. Okay. So I'll go very quickly through these. This tells you, this is the scientific paper which identified the CHG marker, the Caucasian hunter-gatherer marker. And this was discovered by scientists in Trinity College by Eppie Jones. And this contributed 50% to the step component, which as we saw was the Yamnaya component, which migrated west, okay? And at that period, I'm sorry, I have a problem with the, Göbekli Tepe, which was the beginning of agriculture, the first major monument to be built, was immediately after the Ice Age, with the Mesolithic and the south of the Caucasus in Anatolia, and this triggered or started the agricultural revolution. And the Yamnaya, as I mentioned, this is considered now, after the most recent studies, to be the origin of the Indo-European family of languages. So German is Indo-European, Celtic is Indo-European, and by definition Irish is Indo-European, English is European, belongs to the Germanic languages, Indian is Indo-European, Pakistani, and so on and so forth. So this is the great family of Indo-European languages, they believe was started by the Yamnaya, and these are the migration paths of the Yamnaya. And okay, and I don't know why this got, okay, we'll skip those slides. Monastic Ireland, we eventually get down in my migration path. We've gone from the Ice Age to the transition from the Ice Age to post-Ice Age to the Mesolithic to the Neolithic, which was the farmers, to the Bronze Age, which were the Yamnaya, the people who brought copper with them, who brought horses, who brought wagons, to the Bell Beaker, and eventually the Bell Beaker became the Celts, and they settled in the Isles. And eventually we had Christianity and we had monastic Ireland. my particular branch of the family were the Corcorans. They originated up around monastic settlements. They're hereditary Aranach family. 30% of the land belonged to the monasteries. The land had to be farmed. These were farmed by a hereditary group of lay people who were called Aranachs, and the Aranach's job was to repair the roof of the church when it leaked, or farmed land, and contribute sons or daughters to be teachers, or to be religious, or brothers or friars, or whatever. So they were generally associated with monastic lands. And I did an exercise of mapping all of the monastic settlements in Ireland to the clusters of the Corcoran surnames according to the census, and we have pretty much a one-to-one mapping. And of course, the monasteries were very vulnerable to Viking attack, and that probably explains a little bit of Viking in me. And either people were captured, taken off to Viking lands, or the Vikings settled in Ireland, became Irish, and so on and so forth. So, right, mapping Irish genealogies. One of the things I want to do, and one of the projects I have, is to map the surnames and the ancient genealogies of Ireland to the Phylogenetic Tree. There are several sources of, although many of our genealogies were destroyed in 1922 during the fire of the Four Courts. People probably don't realize we have some of the best ancient genealogies of Europe. We have huge corpus of ancient genealogies. I've identified about 20 sources. I have a copy of the Great Book of Irish Genealogies here. The Annals of Ireland, the different Annals of Ulster, of Inishfallen, of Leinster, and so on and so forth. The O'Clery book, the Speckled Book of the MacEgans, and so on and so forth. So we have a great collection of ancient genealogy. These haven't really been digitized or indexed or used properly, and it would be these are examples of these genealogies. I have several of these things, and I'm in the process of digitizing them and indexing them. And it was a scholar in Trinity who identified the top 100 ancient Irish pedigrees, and he published them on the book. Again, these are not put online. They're not put into a proper GEDCOM. They could easily be put onto Wikitree or onto something like that, and be used for connecting our modern families or our modern genealogies back to the ancient genealogies of Ireland. Right? And the process for doing this is to scan it, to digitize it, to index it, to put it online. Here's an example of one of the genealogies, the Ubarica. And again, they're very extensive. They have lots of information, but they're generally on paper records. They're not in a GEDCOM, and they're not in a useful format for using our modern tools. And it's quite possible to extract all of the names from these. And on the left, we see the genetic or the DNA markers associated with surnames, and we can map those to the surnames and then map those surnames back to the ancient genealogies. This is an example from the Great Book of Irish Genealogies, and here is the original of the book by MacPhershuk, Dubhtach MacPhershuk, which is in the UCD archives. Strangely enough, this one here is online. This one here is not online. So, there is work to be done, to make all of this useful. And this is how we would do it here. And this here is what we call a phylogenetic tree. It is the tree of mankind. This is the L21 branch. As you mentioned, a lot of people in Ireland, this is the Irish branch. It's one I belong to, and I belong to one of the branches down here. This is M222 here. And where is the F21? I should know this by now, but here's the F21. So I belong in here somewhere. And yeah, so this tree gets more and more detailed all of the time, and eventually we can map a single SNP to a single surname or a group of surnames. And this is how we would do it, mapping the phylogenetic tree to the ancient genealogies. And then we would be able to identify the association of the surnames, which surnames belong to others, which ones are related either to clan, but be able to do it based on DNA evidence as opposed to, you know, the written evidence. And I would say about 50% of the ancient genealogies were probably you know, written due to political reasons to belong to the person in power at the time, or there could have been non-paternal events, there could have been adoptions, there could have been all sorts of reasons for the genealogies not being correct. And these are maps in Cork. There's some work done in mapping our surnames to geographic locations. And this one here is, we have identified about 100 surnames which map to the phylogenetic tree. About 100 between Ireland and Scotland, about 50 of those are Irish. We would like to get to about 100 surnames and map them to a specific tree. For example, I mentioned earlier the Eli O'Carroll, which is my marker, right? And that is mapped to a specific SNP here. We know that a descendant of Charles Carroll of Carleton has tested, and he matches this map. And some branches of the Corcorans match him, some branches of the O'Flanagans, the O'Carrolls, and so on and so forth. The traditional septs which belong to that name. Other examples would be Munster names: Lee, Manny, Sullivan, McCarthy, Donoghue, the Dalcash, the O'Briens, the Kennedys, and so on and so forth. But we have a lot more work to do on this, and I think I'll be retiring next year sometime, and hopefully I'll be able to get the time to spend some time in this hobby, you know, because it really does take time. These are maps I drew of the frequencies of SNPs in Ireland, and we see the frequency of DF21, which is my one, and its highest frequency is in Galway. DF49, this is the M222, it's in Ireland 9 Hostes. The highest frequency is in Mayo, but also in Donegal, Northwest Ireland. The Munsters are the C4466 in Cork and Kerry. There's a funny story about Jackie Healy-Rae tested, and he was expecting to be 100% Kerry. He came out to be 100% Cork. I think he said it was car crash TV, but you know. And then there was Z253 again. This is a Munster type signature. One of the projects I think would be very useful would be if we could get to, we have about 2,500 civil parishes in Ireland. If we could, you know, test the most local people in the parishes. I don't think, you know, the average test costs about, you know, you can get a test for about €50. If you budgeted about €250 per parish, 5 tests per parish, you could create a very, very detailed and very useful reference genome for Ireland. Again, it takes organizational effort, takes a little bit of financing, not a lot of financing, but it's certainly a project which could be achieved. This is, again, looking at Irish reference genome. We're familiar with the Irish DNA Atlas, which I think had a few hundred samples. We have the Trinity College Irish Insular Genome. We have the Ancestry DNA, which used the direct-to-consumer genetics. We have living DNA, and we have the work of ISOGG and FTDNA. So again, why do we do all of this? It's connecting the diaspora. This is a recent book which came out. The name of the author just escaped me for the minute, but it's about the famous people in the Irish diaspora. It's a few hundred stories of members of the Irish diaspora who left the country in dire circumstances, worked hard, and eventually became successful either in business or in politics or in arts or in writing or in creative and endeavors, or they may have been religious, they may have been the monks who went to Ireland, they could have been the winemakers who were part of the wine geese. So that's a quick overview of my experience, and I'll probably stop at this stage and take questions.